Prime Minister, Labor's announcing a plan today for deeper and broader engagement in the Pacific, in its words. Isn't that the lesson from China's pact with the Solomons, that we need to increase the level of engagement with Pacific Islands?
Well, I could understand Labor's criticisms if we hadn't established 6 additional embassies, missions as they're called, in the Pacific. I could understand if Australia hadn't moved to be the only country in the world that has embassies, missions in every single one of the 20 Pacific Island Forum nations. I could understand if Australia, under our government, hadn't moved to provide Guardian-class patrol boats to all of those Pacific Island nations to protect their fisheries and to preserve their security. I could understand if I hadn't been the first Prime Minister to go back into the Solomon Islands since Kevin Rudd, or more so, the first one for a direct bilateral meeting with the Prime Minister of Vanuatu since Bob Hawke, and the same when it comes to Prime Minister Bainimarama for a direct bilateral meeting in Fiji. I mean, I've had over 100 engagements with Pacific leaders over the course of the last 3 years. If we hadn't stepped up and ensured that our ODA, our overseas development assistance and support in the Pacific, hadn't got to $1.8 billion a year, if we hadn't established the Pacific Financing Facility that is investing in projects like the Tina River Electrification Project, or providing the additional financial support through loans and support to the Papua New Guinean government, with whom I have almost constant engagement. I could understand Labor's criticisms if none of those things had happened. But in August of last year, this is what Richard Marles said about our government's engagement in the Pacific. He said, "It would be wrong to suggest that Australia has not properly allocated resources to its relationship with the Pacific. On the contrary," he said, "we are genuinely present in the region." So I find it odd that, having been so adamant and supportive of what Australia was doing, what our government was doing in the Pacific, that on the eve of election, someone who runs their speeches past the Chinese government before giving them is now going to be critical of us. I note what they've said today. What they're effectively saying is they're going to keep doing what we've been doing. There's one difference, though. I sent in the AFP. The Labor Party wants to send in the ABC when it comes to their Pacific solution. They have a Q&A solution in the Pacific. What we have is real investment in our partnerships with the region. The BlackRock facility in Fiji, for example. That is a training centre for Fijian military to be able to participate in the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations. We built that facility. I mean, Frank Bainimarama, the Prime Minister of Fiji, was trained in Australia. And so for Labor to run around and pretend that somehow there hasn't been significant investment in training, whether it be in the Defence Forces, supporting with additional assets, particularly the Guardian-class patrol boats, investing heavily in their economic infrastructure and their economic opportunities, is absolutely absurd. They are playing politics with the Pacific, and the only ones who are benefiting from Labor's attacks on the government is the Chinese government, and it would seem the ABC.